Okay, here we are, your very last lecture of the class. This is going to be a relatively quick lecture. We're going to talk about getting out there in the world. We're going to talk about the urban environment and the suburban environment. Mostly, we'll talk a little bit about museums. So let's go ahead and jump in. So we're going to kind of go with the urban landscape first. And with that, we want to really talk about museums because that is the most iconic place that we see art in culture and in the urban landscape especially. So we have this word, museum, has classical origins. In its Greek form, museon is meant seat of the muses. So the muses, of course, were the ones that inspired artists and musicians and writers, etc. Designated as a philosophical institution or a place of contemplation. So we have the Louvre in Paris here. While museums have long been the seat of the art world for many artists, especially in the modern era, they begin to question not only the role of art in society, but how art should be made. And of course, we're aware of this when we looked at artists like Manet, the Salon de Réfusé. Even before that, there were artists who were, kind of thinking outside the box. But let me jump back to the Louvre for just a second. This is really one of the world's first, or really the first major museum, and this happened under Napoleon. And the Louvre was a palace for a very long time, and he decided to take just a part of it, at least at this time, and convert it into a place where the public could come and see art. It was kind of a little bit of propaganda. See, I am for the people, etc. And so that's really where we see the first museum. And of course, he looted major artworks from all over the world. So a lot of the story of museums, the history of museums, is not necessarily a nice one. There's a lot of art theft that goes on when there's colonialism and war and all of these things. Art kind of tends to be part of the spoils of war, and there's a lot of interesting stories there. Okay, so while we're talking about some of these groups of artists that tried to kind of break the mold, we've talked about a lot of them. We've talked about the Impressionists, we've talked about the Romantics and the Realists, we've talked about the Salon, we've talked about the Dada artists and the Surrealists, but one we haven't touched on, which is a more minor art movement, but an important one, especially in modern history. And that's Futurism. It's specifically known as Italian Futurism. So it really was born in Italy, kind of right before the reign of Mussolini, and then it kind of lived on under Mussolini in a way, and then kind of went away after that. So it wasn't a very long movement. But this is a movement that originated in Italy, 20th century, emphasized and glorified themes associated with contemporary concepts of the future, including speed, technology, youth and violence, objects such as the car, the airplane, and the industrial city. These are the things they really celebrated. They thought war was a cleansing entity, a cleansing tool for culture. They too kind of wanted to move away from classicism, but in a different way. And we kind of look back at these guys, and a lot of them were like, you know what, they were jerks. They weren't really nice guys. When you read the Futurist Manifesto, a lot of artists at this time, they would kind of form these artist groups, and they would write a manifesto or a set of rules about how they believe art should be made, and basically pledging, this is what we're going to do and what we're all about. And it's very violent. It's very sexist. They didn't really believe women held a very high position in the art world or in culture, for that matter. They were a very strange bunch. They lauded war. They really believed in World War I. Of course, then several of them died during the war, and by the end of the war, their tune had somewhat changed. But what's interesting is when we look at movements like this, in retrospect, it's okay to not, just because artwork's in a museum and they might have been, a brilliant artist, it's okay to look back and say, you know what, but their ideas, their concepts sometimes were not always the greatest, or these weren't the greatest people. But it's all about cultural context and historical context, isn't it? What they thought at the moment, what we know now that they didn't know, etc. So we have Giacomo Balla here, his work Streetlight. And you can see this really kinetic work of art. So he's really celebrating uh, electricity. And so we have the moon in the background. And so we kind of have this idea of the sun and the moon. And of course, the sun kind of holds all the power, right? And the sun has kind of been replaced with this electric street light here that's being celebrated. I love just all these, blips of color and energy that you see radiating here. And so we see that a lot in their work. We see an actual demonstration of movement, of power, of electricity. We see it radiate. We see the unseen a lot of times in their work. And it's very beautiful and very powerful. And you can see why at this time. This is when Paris, Rome, a lot of these cities were being electrified for the first time. This is the new urban landscape. And so this was a very exciting moment. So we also have artists like Umberto Boccioni, and this is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. They often had these very long titles that were almost studies in science and movement. And this is kind of supposed to represent the modern man, this new kind of mechanized creature who's pushing through the past, who's pushing through space. So we're supposed to feel like this is, as you're trudging along in life, and even as you're just walking, that space isn't just this, open, airy, fluid thing, that it's something we have to move and push through matter. And so we see, kind of trudging with these big plinths as feet, and he almost has a helmet as a head. So there's ideas of a soldier here. And so this is the modern man that he's representing here. And so this was very much about urbanism that we see in this movement. And so let's jump ahead, and we're going to talk about public art. So often artists are commissioned. We should know the word commission by now when we talked about the role of artists in society. So commissioned by public and or government entities to create art for public spaces. So in the U.S., this is the National Endowment of the Arts that does this most often. And they give grants to fund artists or to create, works specifically for public spaces. And yet sometimes this work can be highly controversial. We have Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, for example, that went up in 1981 in the Federal Plaza in New York City. And so here's an aerial view of it. So we have this big round Federal Plaza with this fountain that actually the fountain didn't even work. And they commissioned Richard Serra, who was, kind of this up-and-coming new sculptor. And this is what he does. He creates this steel arc that's just slightly tilted. It stood about 10 feet tall, I believe. And this is what it was. And there were a lot of people who praised it and a lot of people who absolutely hated it. It ended up, I believe, in 1985 was the year, I may be wrong on that it was torn down eventually. So this was a big controversy because it made people start to question, well, this was taxpayer money that was going into this, so who actually gets to decide and approve these endowed public artworks? It's interesting that even though it did eventually, the court case won for it to be torn down, it didn't really have the majority of support in the public for it to be torn down. But it was the voices of the few and the powerful versus the many. And what it also brought up a big discussion about was this kind of small, intellectual, elitist art crowd that, of course, praised it, and that didn't really represent the majority of the people, the public. So it brought up some really interesting debates about art in the urban environment. And, do we just accept what's given to us, or do we get to have a say, an opinion? I won't tell you what my opinion is on the work. But there is a link here to a short clip from the court case about this work. And I'd love for you to view that. And Richard Serra has some really interesting things to say about it. Of course, we have other public works that aren't, other urban works that are not public in nature. So this is designed by Frank Gehry. This is the Walt Disney Concert Hall in downtown LA. So if you aren't like me and moved out of California, and if you're right there, you can take a train ride right into downtown and see this. If you haven't been, it's a beautiful, beautiful structure. And there's a link about this as well that I'd like you to watch. It's right next to the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion that was built in the 1970s, and Frank Gehry kind of reacted against the straight lines, almost classicism of that building, and he created something that he believes he's inspired really by sails in the sea, so sails on boats. That's where a lot of his inspiration came from for this. But so here we have something that really is innovative, that is both accepting and rejecting the landscape around it, and but the people don't have a say in it. But so that's an interesting discussion too, because it is a public building. If and the inside is really beautiful as well. So if you have a chance to go and see it, I highly recommend it. One thing is there was an apartment building nearby that did complain because the way the sun was shining off of some of the steel into their apartments was not very pleasant. Okay, so we want to look at the fact that art isn't always displayed in a traditional museum or gallery setting, or in, as these public artworks. As we discussed in lecture on context, how can the physical setting change the way a work of art is understood? So here we have art in an urban context, but this is a kind of street art, perspective, and we have it in this big warehouse. How would you, if you were to walk in this place versus, the Louvre or the Getty, or just a white cube gallery in a, kind of a high-end neighborhood, how would you react differently to the art? Would you feel more casual? Would you dress differently than you would? Would you feel like you could walk up and touch? Would you talk more? All of these things can affect the way we understand and interact with the work, the environment especially. So I want you to consider that. So let's look at a few other urban artworks. This is really kind of a fun lecture. We're not taking this lecture too seriously. So we have artists like this guy in Friesland, Holland, which happens to be where my husband's family is from. And you can often see artists using the urban environment to send a message. And this is quite a compelling one. So we've got these large eggs being, fried on the sidewalk. So what do you think this work is about? And here's a close-up of one of them. Of course, everyone in Holland tends to ride bikes, which I love. So we've got, the egg yolks here, and there's definitely an important contemporary issue that is being talked about here. It's so hot that you can fry an egg on the sidewalk, so I'll let you kind of figure out what he's talking about. And there's a similar subject matter going on here. This is by Nelia Azevedo. This is called Melting Man. He's done this in several different places, but this one is on the steps of the Berlin Museum. And sometimes urban works is temporary. So how is this temporal work have a strong impact on the viewer? So because this is all little men made of ice, of course we know that it's not going to last. It's temporal. It's going to melt away. And so it's kind of one of those you had to be there to see it moments. So there's almost an aspect of performance art that goes on here. And so we're only seeing the aftermath. We're kind of seeing a dead work, aren't we? In a way. And the closer you look at this, it kind of gets a little bit morbid, doesn't it? So we have these men sitting, and then we have some that, only a torso is left, that the legs are starting to melt and disappear. There's no arms anymore. And so, again, there's a similar subject matter going on here and going on here. And urban artists and street artists have kind of an interesting perspective and an interesting set of tools at their disposal to communicate such messages. Here's another view of the Melting Man. Okay, let's talk about suburbia, because this is where a lot of us grew up, in this kind of landscape. Does anyone know what film this is from? Quite iconic film that Johnny Depp was in. I'll kind of leave it at that. So let's talk about some of the early movements that celebrated, not necessarily suburbia, but kind of this smaller cultural context. we're not talking about the big, loud urban landscape. We're talking about something a little more intimate here. So we have regionalism, and this is a movement in American modern art that focused on scenes of rural life. So these artists rejected the fast-paced, the technological advancing urban scene in favor of images of the American heartland. So this is, kind of anti-futurism. This was very much the opposite of what the futurists were doing in Italy just a few years earlier, celebrating this loud, mechanized, futuristic culture. And so Grant Wood, of course, paints American Gothic, one of the most iconic works of Americana or regionalism, and he was one of the regionalist artists. And of course, there's a lot going on here that people love to discuss. For one, he's using this Gothic revival style farmhouse in the back, but and there's a wind vane on top of it. But the way with the window and the pitch of the roof, it almost feels like a chapel or the steeple of a church. And so there's this kind of small town religious iconography that goes on here. Of course, we have the farmer and his daughter. Actually, the people who posed, this was a dentist. This was a Grant Wood's dentist and his daughter who were posing for this. They're very plain, very somber, very kind of simple people. And there was some debate, when he first exhibited this, that, oh, he's poking fun at this kind of, small town life, that he's making these people look like simpletons. But he was very much, no, that's not at all what I'm doing. This was very much, for him, a celebration of this kind of classic American culture and these, hardy folk and small town values, etc. And so this catches on, and this becomes a quite popular movement in American art. We have artists like Edward Hopper, who was not a regionalist, but who also comments on the American landscape. And he particularly liked to comment on the loneliness, the isolation of the American landscape. We see that with his Nighthawks in the urban landscape. And he kind of hops back and forth. Hopper, no pun intended, that was an accident. He kind of goes back and forth between this urban landscape and this kind of small town, urban, and then suburban and rural landscape in his work. But we've got this, office in a small city, and this guy who's sitting in this corner office in this fairly modern-looking building. Some of the buildings around him are less so, and so in small town, of course, there's this kind of colliding of the old and the new, and he feels very isolated and lonely, and yet there's this sense of kind of looking out towards the future and kind of wondering what that is. Here's one more of his, suburban, small town people images, and this is called Summer Evening. This is done in 1947, and there's always something slightly unsettling to me about Hopper's paintings. And so we have this young, couple that we're assuming are kind of teenagers, and you're always playing the voyeur in Hopper's work. So we're always kind of the ones watching and looking in. We're an outsider, so we're in a way isolated from the scene, isolated from the figures and what's going on. We don't get to be a part of it, and so there's something there to think about as well. But there's always this very kind of intimate moments that are happening within the artwork, and we don't really know what's going on in this moment. We can start to imagine, but there's a link that I want you to watch on this as well. And so let's talk about Americana, which is kind of this sister term with regionalism, a little bit broader than regionalism, but we have this idea of, relating to the history, geography, folklore, cultural heritage of the United States. And there is no more famous artist who works in this vein than Norman Rockwell. So most known for his very quaint depictions of mid-century American family life, such as this depiction of Thanksgiving dinner. And it's called Freedom from Want. Interesting title. Look at the year, again, 1943, what's going on at this time. And so I want you to really think about what emotions does this image stir in you. When I've taught this similar course, Art Appreciation, at Cal State Fullerton, and I have, 125 students usually in that class. I love showing this painting when we talk about the urban and suburban landscape and just asking, okay, what does this stir in you? And you'd be amazed at the different responses that we would get. Some are like, oh yeah, that reminds me of my family and what it was like growing up. And, or some were like, I don't relate to that. That's idealistic. That wasn't how my family was. I come from a broken home. And so there was a jealousy. So it's interesting now to put something in the context of contemporary culture that was meant to be, in 1943, and how that can change our perspective. But this is very much correlating to the American dream, right? And so really analyze, what is that? And what is the American dream, and how has that changed? But Rockwell wasn't always known for depicting the rosy, even though we kind of associate him very much with the Saturday Evening Post, with these really quaint, lovely, kind of docile moments. He did some pretty interesting stuff. There's been some renewed scholarship on Rockwell recently, because for a long time in the art world, he was kind of considered to be a little bit kitsch, a little bit too overly sentimental, and that it didn't really have as much value in the story of art history. But they're starting to kind of evaluate his work a little bit. And we have works like this, The Problem We All Live With. This is in 1964. So, of course, we know what's going on at this point in history. Notice the derogatory slang on the back wall. Over here, there's the KKK. So he's making comments on this historical moment and what is going on here. And so this is very important scenes in American culture. And while he kind of is able to do it in a way that it's still somewhat calm and beautiful, just the way he paints, there's this, balanced, almost neoclassicism in his figures. It's still, rings true and brings us those stories and kind of, makes us think, so how as a nation have we changed since this moment? So there's no singular experience of suburbia is kind of what we're getting at by looking at images like this, and how different people react to it. So what do you think this artist is trying to communicate? This was a street artist named Ian Strange, who just a couple years ago did this exhibition called Suburban. And there's a little link for you to watch his small, very short, it's only about 3 minutes or so, video about this project. And again, it's another perspective on the suburban landscape, and how, your experience might be different than someone else's. And so we can't pinpoint a genre or a context or a landscape as being just one-dimensional. And this is a little bit more for fun that I want you to watch. It's about 15-20 minutes or so. But really, really interesting. I love showing this in a class where we can discuss it as well. So if you watch this and you find anything interesting you'd like to discuss, please feel free to email me. But this was something that was built in Disneyland in the 1950s and 60s. It's called the Monsanto House of the Future. And I want you to watch it, and I want you to consider how our perspective on the future has changed since Disney's House of the Future, how gender roles have changed. Because it's a very kind of traditional view on family. I want you to notice the lack of presence of the father and son for most of the film. So it's quite interesting. But this very much has to do with the American dream as well. It was ripped out in 1967. But this was kind of a tour, and this is what they believed. The house, by now we would all be living in houses like this, and of course they're all made of plastic, which we of course have a different perspective on now as well. And last but certainly not least, I have a clip for you from a photographer named Stephen Shore, who is a brilliant photographer who deals with the American landscape. This is from his series Uncommon Spaces. He was actually a very young man when he somehow ended up in Andy Warhol's factory. The factory was basically his studio, but where a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll happened. In the factory, a lot of iconic people were there in this kind of strange, short historical moment. But Stephen Shore kind of came out of that. And he's very long been fascinated with the American landscape. And so I want you to look at his work, watch the clip, and then how would you describe his work and what he's communicating about Americana, about the urban landscape, about the suburban landscape, etc. So enjoy.